The dining room was steeped in silence, save for the soft clink of silverware against porcelain. Sophia sat at the far end of the long, polished oak table, her eyes darting between her husband, James, and his son, Ethan. The air felt heavy, charged with an unspoken tension that only she seemed to notice. James, as always, was absorbed in his phone, his shoulders hunched over the screen. His once vibrant blue eyes had dulled over the years, reflecting not fatigue but an indifference that stung more deeply than any harsh word ever could. Sophia sipped her wine, its sharp tang offering little comfort. She glanced at Ethan, who sat directly across from her. Unlike his father, Ethan's presence was magnetic. His posture relaxed but alert, his piercing gaze unervingly steady. Ethan had returned home the previous week after finishing his final semester of college. Sophia had expected the awkwardness that came from years of distance, but Ethan's ease unsettled her. He carried himself with a confidence that seemed to mock her own carefully maintained composure. His voice, deep and measured, cut through her thoughts. "How's work been, Sophia?" he asked, breaking the silence. She started, almost spilling her wine. "It's been fine. Busy as always." She forced a smile, though her voice betrayed the strain she tried to hide. James barely looked up. "She's always busy," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone at the table. Sophia's chest tightened. It wasn't the words but the tone, a mixture of dismissal and mild annoyance, that twisted the knife. She placed her glass down with more force than intended, the sound startling even her. Ethan's gaze shifted to his father. "Sounds like she works hard. Maybe she deserves a little more recognition for it," he said. His voice calm but pointed. James finally looked up, his expression blank. "I recognize it," he said flatly. Then with a shrug he returned to his phone. The silence returned, heavier this time. Sophia felt her cheeks flush, a mixture of embarrassment and an emotion she couldn't quite name. She looked at Ethan, expecting to see pity or annoyance. Instead, his expression was unreadable. His dark eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her heart race. Later that evening, as she stood in the kitchen washing dishes, the scene replayed in her mind. She scrubbed a plate harder than necessary, her frustration bubbling to the surface. The years of neglect, of feeling invisible, pressed against her like a weight she could no longer bear. "You shouldn't let him talk to you like that." The voice behind her made her jump. She turned to see Ethan leaning casually against the doorway, his arms crossed. His presence filled the small space, and she felt her pulse quicken. "It's fine," she said quickly, turning back to the sink. "He doesn't mean anything by it." Ethan stepped closer, his footsteps deliberate and measured. "Doesn't mean anything. He barely notices you, Sophia. You deserve better than that." She froze, the soapy plate slipping from her fingers and landing with a splash. The truth in his words struck her like a blow. She turned to face him, her breath hitching as she realized how close he had come. "You don't understand," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's complicated." Ethan tilted his head, his expression softening. "I understand more than you think," he said quietly. "You've given him everything, and he gives you nothing in return. That's not complicated, that's wrong." Sophia opened her mouth to respond, but the words caught in her throat. She felt the sting of tears behind her eyes and quickly looked away, ashamed of her own vulnerability. Ethan reached out, his hand brushing against hers. The touch was brief, but it sent a jolt through her that left her breathless. "You're not alone," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "If you ever need someone to talk to." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Before she could respond, he stepped back, giving her space but leaving an unmistakable impression. That night, as Sophia lay in bed beside James, who had already fallen into his usual deep, indifferent sleep, she stared at the ceiling, her mind racing. Ethan's words echoed in her ears, their weight impossible to ignore. For the first time in years she felt seen, not as a wife or a homemaker, but as a woman. She closed her eyes, but sleep eluded her. A quiet storm had been set in motion, one she was powerless to stop. The house was unusually quiet that evening, a stillness that seemed to stretch into the corners of every room. Sophia sat on the couch in the dimly lit living room, a half-finished glass of wine on the table beside her. The television played a muted drama, its flickering light casting shadows across her face. Her thoughts, however, were far from the screen. James was away on another business trip, his absence leaving a vacuum that neither comforted nor unsettled her anymore. What did unsettle her, however, was the knowledge that Ethan was still awake somewhere in the house. His presence had grown impossible to ignore since their brief exchange in the kitchen days earlier. A creak on the staircase drew her attention. She looked up to see Ethan descending, his movements unhurried, his gaze finding hers almost immediately. He wore a loose sweatshirt and jeans, yet the confidence in his stride made the casual attire seem intentional. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice breaking the stillness. Sophia shook her head, her fingers tightening around the glass. "Whoa, you." Ethan walked over and sat on the armchair opposite her, leaning back with an ease that made her stomach flutter. "Not really. It's too quiet around here." She nodded, though the quiet had never bothered her before. Now it seemed oppressive, amplifying the weight of their unspoken tension. Ethan's gaze lingered on her for a moment before he spoke again. "Do you ever think about what you want, Sophia? I mean, what you really want?" The question caught her off guard. She laughed nervously, the sound too loud in the still room. "What kind of question is that?" "I'm serious," he said, leaning forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "You spend all your time taking care of everyone else. When was the last time someone asked what you needed?" Sophia's heart thudded in her chest. She looked away, focusing on the glass in her hand. "That's not how life works, Ethan. You can't just—" "Why not?" he interrupted, his tone gentle but insistent. "Why shouldn't it work that way?" She felt the weight of his gaze and dared to meet it. His eyes were steady, probing, and something in them made her pulse race. "It's complicated," she said softly, the words feeling inadequate even as she spoke them. "Maybe it doesn't have to be." His voice was low, almost a whisper, and the intimacy of it sent a shiver down her spine. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them felt electric, charged with possibilities she couldn't allow herself to consider. "I should go to bed," she said abruptly, setting her glass down and rising to her feet. Ethan stood as well, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't block her path, but his presence was enough to stop her in her tracks. "Sophia," he said, his voice firm but not demanding, "you deserve to be happy. Don't forget that." She turned to face him, her breath hitching at the intensity in his eyes. "Good night, Ethan," she said, her voice barely audible. He nodded but didn't move as she walked past him, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain he could hear it. The next morning, Sophia awoke to the smell of coffee wafting through the house. For a brief moment, she thought James had returned early, but the memory of the previous night quickly dispelled that notion. When she entered the kitchen, she found Ethan standing at the counter, his back to her as he poured coffee into 2 mugs. The sight of him in the morning light, relaxed and unguarded, made her chest tighten. "Morning," he said, turning to face her. "Good morning," she replied, her voice tinged with hesitation. He handed her a mug, their fingers brushing in the exchange. The touch was fleeting but enough to send a jolt through her. She took a sip, grateful for the excuse to look away. "Are you doing anything today?" he asked, leaning against the counter. Sophia shook her head. "Not really. Just the usual." Ethan studied her for a moment before speaking. "Come for a walk with me." The suggestion surprised her. "A walk?" "Yeah," he said, a small smile playing at his lips. "It's a nice day. You could use some fresh air." She hesitated, the practical part of her mind urging her to decline. But something about the way he looked at her made it impossible to say no. "All right," she said finally. The walk was quiet at first, the only sounds the crunch of gravel beneath their feet and the distant rustle of leaves. They strolled through the park near their house, the late morning sun casting dappled patterns on the ground. "I used to come here a lot as a kid," Ethan said, breaking the silence. "It's different now, though." Muller. Sophia nodded, though she had no memories of the park from her own past. She had moved here after marrying James, inheriting a life she hadn't built. As they walked, Ethan began to share stories of his childhood, painting a picture of a boy who had grown up too fast. Sophia listened, her heart aching for reasons she couldn't fully articulate. By the time they returned home, the dynamic between them had shifted. The tension was still there, but now it was layered with something softer, something that felt dangerously close to intimacy. Sophia stood in the garden, her hands brushing against the lavender bushes she had planted years ago. The soft hum of bees filled the air, but she hardly noticed. The sun was warm on her skin, but inside she felt a storm brewing. The walk with Ethan the day before had left her uneasy. It wasn't just the ease of their conversation or the warmth in his gaze. It was the way he seemed to see her, in ways James hadn't for years. Behind her, the back door creaked open. She turned, half expecting James, though she knew he wasn't due back for days. Ethan stepped out instead, carrying 2 glasses of iced tea. His movements were unhurried, his expression calm, but there was something in his eyes that made her pulse quicken. "You looked like you could use a break," he said, handing her a glass. She hesitated before taking it, her fingers brushing his. "Thanks," she murmured, her voice barely audible. Ethan leaned against the railing, watching her as she sipped the tea. "You've been out here for a while," he said. "Thinking about something." Sophia laughed softly, though the sound lacked humor. "I guess you could say that." He tilted his head, his gaze steady. "Want to talk about it?" She hesitated, the words catching in her throat. How could she explain the weight she carried without revealing too much? "It's nothing," she said finally, looking away. "It's not nothing," he said, his tone gentle but firm. "I can see it in your eyes, Sophia. You're not happy." Her breath caught, and she turned to face him. "Ethan, you don't understand. It's complicated." "That's what you always say," he said, stepping closer. "But maybe it doesn't have to be." She felt the heat of his presence, the way his nearness made her heart race. "This isn't right," she said, her voice trembling. "Why not?" he asked, his voice low. "Because it's wrong to want more. To want to feel alive." His words struck a chord deep within her. She looked up at him, her defenses crumbling under the weight of his gaze. "You don't know what you're saying," she whispered. "I know exactly what I'm saying," he said, his voice steady. "I see you, Sophia. I see the woman you are, the woman you're afraid to be. And I know I could give you what you deserve." The air between them felt electric, charged with a tension that threatened to consume her. She knew she should walk away, should put an end to this before it went too far. But the part of her that had been starved for so long, the part that craved connection and passion, held her in place. She stepped back, shaking her head as if to clear it. "This can't happen," she said, more to herself than to him. Ethan didn't move, his expression calm but determined. "I'm not going to push you, Sophia," he said. "But I need you to know I'm here. If you ever decide you're ready." His words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Sophia turned and walked back into the house, her mind racing. That evening, as she prepared dinner, her thoughts kept drifting back to Ethan. She tried to focus on the mundane tasks, the chopping of vegetables, the sizzling of meat in the pan, but his voice echoed in her mind. The sound of footsteps pulled her from her thoughts. Ethan entered the kitchen, his sleeves rolled up, a disarming smile on his face. "Need any help?" She shook her head, trying to appear composed. "I've got it under control." He didn't leave, instead leaning against the counter and watching her work. "You're always taking care of everyone else," he said. "When was the last time someone took care of you?" The question made her pause, the knife stilling in her hand. She didn't answer, couldn't answer. The truth was too painful to admit. Ethan stepped closer, his presence commanding yet gentle. You don't have to keep doing this, Sophia, he said, his voice soft. You deserve more. Her resolve wavered, the weight of his words pressing against her like a tide she couldn't resist. She turned to face him, her heart pounding in her chest. Ethan, she began, her voice faltering. Before she could say more, he reached out, his hand brushing against her cheek. The touch was light, tentative, but it sent a spark through her that left her breathless. Tell me to stop, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. She opened her mouth, but no words came. Instead, she found herself leaning into his touch, the longing she had tried to suppress bubbling to the surface. A loud crash from the living room shattered the moment, and they sprang apart. Sophia's heart raced as she turned toward the noise. I should check on that, she said quickly, her voice shaking. Ethan nodded, stepping back. Of course. As she walked away, her mind swirled with conflicting emotions. The moment had passed, but the feelings it stirred lingered, leaving her shaken and unsure of what would come next.